Today we are going to talk about reflexes. Reflexes are rapid and predictable, and they're involuntary responses to a stimulus, and they occur over specific pathways called reflex arcs. A reflex arc is a direct route from a sensory neuron to an interneuron to an effector. So these nerve impulses don't have to go to the brain to be processed. There's 5 basic elements to a reflex arc. You have a receptor, a sensory neuron, an integration center or interneuron, a motor neuron, and an effector, which is what the motor neuron acts upon. There's a couple types of reflex arcs. So there's the somatic reflexes. These are reflexes that stimulate skeletal muscle. So an example would be pulling your hand away from a hot object if you were to set your hand on the stove or something. Autonomic reflexes regulate the activity of smooth muscle, the heart, and glands. Examples of autonomic reflexes would be like the regulation of smooth muscle, heart and blood pressure, glands, and the digestive system. As we saw in the diagram a couple slides ago, the 5 elements of a reflex are the sensory receptor, the sensory neuron, the integration center in the central nervous system, which could be just the spinal cord, the motor neuron, and then the effector organ. The sensory receptor reacts to the stimulus. The sensory neuron carries the message to the integration center. The integration center processes the information and directs motor output. The motor neuron carries the message to an effector, and the effector organ is the muscle or gland that is stimulated. So the receptor receives the message. The sensory neuron carries the message to the central nervous system. The central nervous system is the integration center that processes the message. The motor neuron carries the message to the muscle or gland, and the effector, which is the muscle or gland, takes action. The simplest reflex does not even use an interneuron. It's called the two-neuron reflex arc, and it just uses one sensory neuron and one motor neuron. An example is the patellar or the knee-jerk reflex. So this is the one where when you go to the doctor's office and they tap on your knee with the hammer and you kick a little bit, it just takes 2 neurons to cause those muscles to contract and to cause that action. So right under your patella is where they hit you with the little rubber hammer, and then that sends a message from the sensory neuron to the central nervous system that connects directly to the motor neuron that causes your quadriceps to contract a little bit, and that's what bends your knee. And this means you still do have those 5 elements of a reflex, right? There's a sensory or stretch receptor, the sensory neuron. The signal is integrated in the central nervous system even if there's no interneuron. And then there's the motor or efferent neuron that carries the message to the muscle, and the effector organ or the muscle that contracts and causes your leg to straighten a little bit. Then there are also 3 neuron reflex arcs. So these have all 5 elements, the receptor, the sensory neuron, but they do also include the interneuron. And so this would be like the flexor or withdrawal reflex. So first, you will experience a stimuli. So in this case, this person is going to get pricked by a tack. So that's the sensory receptor, and it's going to perceive some sort of pain, stimulus. That sensory receptor sends the message via the sensory or afferent neuron to the central nervous system. Because this might involve more than one muscle, it's a type of message that benefits from the integration of an interneuron. So this type of reflex uses an interneuron to help process information. Then you have a motor or efferent neuron that sends the message to the muscle that something needs to happen. And finally, the effector organ can respond. And if it's something like pulling your hand away from something, you might use your bicep, but you might also stimulate some other nerves like your brachialis or some of the other muscles that support the function of that muscle.